Good afternoon and welcome to the Healthy Indoors Show. I'm your host, Bob Krell, and we have a great show today. I'm very excited. Our guest today is Emily Anthus. She is the science journalist and editor, and she has a new book that just recently released called The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. So really looking forward to the conversation we're about to have here. We'll have our Q&A chat line open for all you guys out there, so you'll be able to ask Emily questions in real time, and we'll be able to actually entertain those during the show. She's also the author of Frankenstein's Cat: Cuddling Up to Biotech's Brave New Beasts, and her work has included work that's appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, Nature, Slate, Business Week, and elsewhere. And her magazine features have won several journalism awards. So Emily has a master's degree in science writing from MIT and a bachelor's degree in the history of science and medicine from Yale. So fairly great credentials there. And she's coming to us live from Brooklyn, New York right now. So I'd like to welcome our guest, Emily. How are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
The joys of live television.
Yes.
So I guess we'll first off, what I'd like to do is get right into it. So your book, The Great Indoors, I had a chance to read a good portion of it last evening. Interesting stuff. So we're going to get right into the details. What prompted you to actually write a book like this?
Well, so as you mentioned, I'm a science writer, so I normally spend a lot of time sort of keeping track of and reading the scientific literature, new studies that are coming out. And a few years ago, maybe more than a few, 5 or 6, I started noticing a lot of studies on what researchers were calling the indoor microbiome. So this was, studies where they'd go into homes or hospitals or offices and swab around and then figure out like what microbes, what species were living in our building. And we can talk a bit more about what they found in a minute. But what blew me away was how much they were finding. That, we normally think of our homes as something that's sort of closed up and sealed up and sort of sterile environments, but they were these incredibly rich environments. And that sort of sparked me to start thinking about our buildings as landscapes and as ecosystems. That tends to be something we associate with the outdoors, but there's this rich world in our buildings that we don't usually appreciate. And so that sort of was a spark for starting to think about the indoor environment in this way.
So this project is not something that you just immediately rolled out. I know it was released last month. How long have you been working on this?
I think I started about 5 years ago. It wasn't full time, I'm also a freelance writer, so on and off. But I think I first really started putting the pieces together in 2015.
And the timing is purely coincidental with the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm assuming.
It is, though I have had people, one, ask if I have undisclosed psychic abilities. And I've also had people ask what I'm planning to write about next so they can be prepared for whatever the next big global event coming down the pike is.
Yeah, I guess, has this pandemic affected, your content since, this was a project you were working on for several years? Has it changed any parts of your messaging or any parts of your content? I mean, do you think there's a different shape or different perspective for the book now based on where we are with this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think there's a slightly different perspective. Fortunately, there's nothing in the book that's like blatantly contradicted by the pandemic or that the pandemic makes incorrect. But I think what it's doing is highlighting the importance of some of the issues I've talked about building healthy indoor environments, about how we can manage threats and crises. And I think it's made people and readers more attuned to and interested in the environments that we're now spending so much time in.
So, are there specific areas that you see that you think would be teachable moments that you share in the book that are really applicable to where we stand right now with the pandemic and spending more time maybe in our home environments?
Oh, well, so I can take the home part in a minute, but actually before
Okay.
you said home, the first thing that came to mind was I have a bit on hospitals, and in particular, some researchers who designed a hospital building explicitly they wanted to create a building that would help us survive the next pandemic. They just started designing it in the aftermath of SARS, and they started creating a building for infectious diseases in which patients would be less likely to spread it to other patients and to healthcare workers, because that was something that happened a lot during SARS. And so a lot of the design elements they built in are helping them manage this pandemic, and I think are lessons for hospitals in the future that maybe want to reduce disease transmission.
This was the facility in Montreal?
No, this
Oh,
is in Sweden, in Malmo,
okay.
Sweden. An infectious disease building there that has been open since I believe 2012 or 2013. But SARS and the outbreak in Montreal was sort of the spark for it.
Got it. I mean, do you think, well, I guess this is kind of a far-reaching question, but do you think that now that we've actually experienced a pandemic on this scale in this century, it's been a while, right, since we've had a global pandemic that was, it's Ebola, obviously SARS, but not never even nearly approaching this scale since the Spanish flu of 1918. Do you think that's going to change the perspective on how people are designing these types of facilities, these healthcare facilities, or areas where we're congregating in mass with people?
I do. And, I don't think it's going to be like a sudden break or a radical new direction, but I do think it will accelerate some trends that were sort of already starting to percolate through the literature and through buildings out there. So, there's been increasing emphasis in the last few years and attention really paid to things like indoor air quality and indoor air pollutants, and designing for like antibiotic resistant bacteria and minimizing that spread. So those were things that researchers were like becoming interested in, but I think that will really accelerate those trends. I think it'll also accelerate some technological trends. So, when we think about the future of offices, I think we'll see a lot more like smart thermostats and smart locks and sort of touchless surfaces that, again, were out there, but I think their adoption will really be sped up in the aftermath of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of behavioral stuff in addition to the the behavioral stuff. I think is the low-lying fruit, right? Individual consumers can change their individual behavior. Little more difficult for you to change the architectural design of your environment.
Though one of the things I talk about, and it's interesting to think about now, is there's precedent for doing just that. So I talk about in the 19th century, cities in the US were really ravaged by infectious disease. And this was before we had antibiotics and before we had vaccines. And a lot of the solutions to that problem, a lot of what helped us conquer those diseases were infrastructural and architectural changes, things like tenement laws that increased ventilation, or the construction of sewers, or changing of zoning laws. So there's definitely a precedent for that sort of urban planning and architectural change to help with disease prevention.
I think also the maybe in recent years the worldwide adoption of the LEED building standard, with the U.S. Green Building Council, and then more recently, the International Well Building Institute. You think, again, more traction? You see that? You think that this an event such as this COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think this drives home the importance of our indoor environments a little more to people?
Absolutely. And I had a very brief call with some people at the International Well Building Institute a few weeks ago, and I think they are getting inundated with requests and interest for, people who maybe might not have thought about how our buildings affect our health, now suddenly very interested. And, I think a lot of building operators and owners want to be able to say to people like, look, we have a certificate of safety, or, whatever it is. They want to show occupants that they are taking steps to make those buildings safe. And so I think that's one way that they're doing it.
And I would assume that's going to actually have a big impact, maybe in the commercial real estate market as we move
Mhm.
forward. But do you see this translating down to the single family residences, and something that's more actionable by consumers, to back to the point of homes?
Yeah, I mean, so on a like what we can do now level, I mean, obviously we could think about how we might be designing homes differently in the future. That's sort of a longer timeline. But, I think I'm hearing even just from people at home who aren't architects or designers or engineers wanting to know what they can do. And I think there are a lot of pretty simple steps, everything from opening a window. We know that COVID-19 is a disease primarily that spreads indoors, and that any sort of outdoor airflow or ventilation is likely to help dilute and disperse the virus. So whether you have an HVAC system that you can change the settings on to bring in more outdoor air instead of just recirculating the same indoor air, that's likely to be helpful, as is opening a window. The nice thing about those is they have a bunch of other benefits that aren't COVID-19 related. So like they reduce your exposure to indoor air pollutants and other toxins. Yeah, and I've been getting questions also about sort of how can we psychologically cope with being in our homes. And one interesting thing that I think hasn't gotten a lot of attention is we've talked a lot about how to maintain social ties during this time of social distancing. And that's important. We need our social connections, but our other sort of innate human need is for privacy and space. And that can be something that's hard to achieve if you live like I do in a 1-bedroom apartment with another human being and a couple of pets. But there's some interesting lessons there from, other extreme environments like space station, about ways to try and carve out privacy and a refuge and retreat space. I mean, one thing I tell people, especially those who might not live in a big house with lots of rooms, is that privacy isn't only your own physical space behind a door. So you can have what you think of as like auditory privacy, which means like maybe you and your wife are both in the living room, but you each have headphones on listening to your own podcast. And that can create sort of a space of a cocooning and a refuge.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting concept. That again, I think we're going to be there's going to be changes. I mean, there have been changes these last several months. I think have affected all of us, and just how we are occupying and behaving in our indoor spaces. So back to your subtitle of the book. Surprising science of how buildings shape our behavior, health, and happiness. Who's your primary audience for this book?
Well, anyone who's interested would be my sort of default response. But I think there are several different types of readers who might be really interested. Anyone who's interested in science and research and science nonfiction, this book is for them. This book is also for architects and designers and engineers and people who are involved in creating our built environments. But then even just the general consumer or anyone who's interested in, how can I have a happier, healthier life, and what sorts of tweaks can I make in my own environment? We'll find useful things in this book. And, to be clear, I understand that it's not under everyone's control to like draw up the plans of their house.
Right.
But there are things we can all do to make our own spaces healthier and work better for us, even if we don't have an architecture degree.
So, I mean, would you do you feel that and this may be not a fair question, but do you feel that the architectural design of a space is more important or equally as important as the behavioral actions of the occupants of the space? Or how do you see the interplay there?
I mean, I think they're both important. Maybe that's a cop-out answer, but I interviewed some researchers who designed a school, an elementary school, using principles of what's known as active design. So the idea is to get kids to be healthier and create environments where they're more physically active and they make healthier food choices. And I thought the way they talked about their job was really interesting. They said, we're designing the hardware, the system that this is going to run on, but also really important is the software. So the school's own programs, like if they want to encourage kids to have healthier eating habits, that comes down to like, are they having bake sales, or like what are they putting on the school lunch cafeteria? So I really think those two things, the hardware and the software, go together. I mean, the hardware and the architectural design, the building structure, I think can make new things possible, but you still need to pay attention to what the humans are doing inside the building.
And that's you raise an interesting thing there with schools, which coincidentally is our cover story for the July issue of Healthy Indoors magazine, getting back to school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you think there's going to be a more of a focus on spaces like schools, which traditionally are, in environments where they're always trying to budgetarily, cut a lot of these features that may, cost a little bit more money, and certainly schools' operating budgets have never been on the increase of late.
Right.
So they seem to have less to work with, and are, a lot of the country has an aging educational infrastructure, right?
Mm-hmm.
No question about it, as far as their facilities. A lot of studies that indicated that you could improve learning outcomes with a better environment. But how do you see that being adapted as we move forward?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the economic piece, and the researcher or the architects I featured in my chapter on schools actually worked within the same budget they would have had if they had not been so innovative. So these interventions don't necessarily have to cost a lot of extra money. I mean, obviously, if you have more money to spend, you can do probably cooler things. But I mean, some of them are basic decisions, like how you orient the building in terms of allowing daylight in, and how you arrange spaces and their relationship to other spaces. Those aren't things that necessarily add costs. So I think there is room for creativity and innovation, even within, sort of our limited school budgets.
I mean, this whole topic of reoccupying schools now, right? The occupancy in schools is super hotly contested. I mean, in the last week in the media, that's one of the lead stories. And again, the school design, some of the stuff you discussed there was obviously pre COVID-19
Mm-hmm.
coronavirus. Has some of the concepts that you laid out, or have some of them been kind of made a little bit outdated already, just as a result of what we're currently experiencing on this scale?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'd say outdated as much as, like, I do think in some of those public spaces, like schools especially, priorities have changed, for sure. Like, I still think there's nothing outdated about wanting to make sure that kids are getting plenty of physical activity. And that's still a public health crisis in the US and other places, but it's certainly less immediate right now. And I would certainly understand if schools are putting less emphasis on that and more emphasis on just making sure that their students can actually get an education without getting the coronavirus. I certainly think some priorities have changed. That said, there are a lot of things that make a good environment in lots of different ways. So, like, you might want to think more about ventilation now that we have COVID-19, but that's also good for learning and cognitive performance. Sure. And other things. So it doesn't have to be either or, but I certainly understand why the priority is on the coronavirus right now.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is. That's the fire we're currently fighting.
Right.
And again, this is, we've been forewarned of this for 17 years since the SARS outbreak, right? 16, 17 years ago. And I think we may not have heeded the warnings of many scientists and medical professionals of, the possibility of this exact type scenario playing out globally, and now it has. And we all, over the years, we all heard about the the Spanish flu and the how horrid that was, right around World War I. But now we're actually seeing it in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, not to the scale that the Spanish flu was, with the fatality rate thus far. So, but
knock on wood.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I'm we're also only 4 months into this, so it's I don't know where this is going. I don't think any of us do. But I'm thinking, it definitely raises some issues. Like in our pre-show when we were speaking about this, do you believe that there's going to be more emphasis on the individual basis of what your home, your living space is. I mean, because you may indeed be spending, you're spending more time there now, right, with all the shutdowns. But going forward, I think there's likely going to be a change in many people's workspaces, right? We're proving that we can work from home. For a lot of the jobs we do don't require us to be at a commercial office space. We can work as teams via video conferencing. So doesn't that put a little more emphasis on what our home environment's like if many of us are going to spend more time at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's something people are interested in, is creating home environments that are, healthy and comfortable. But also, I think you'll see like an increasing premium placed on things like flexibility. So, a home that can easily convert some walk-in closet to an office if the need arises, or into an impromptu schoolroom. I think the only certain thing about the future is that it's going to be uncertain, and we will have more crises, whether it's pandemics or hurricane, all those things. And so I think creating homes, but also offices and schools that have sort of allow flexibility in use and configuration, is one of the ways we can prepare for that.
Yeah, and you touched on the education side too. Many of the schools, around across the country have been closed for the past several months, or closed early in the school year. Now we'd be in summer break, but yeah, will there be a change in how we actually do our public education now? Will some of it actually, going forward, will we start adopting some virtual classroom environments, or augmenting it? Hard to say, right? But that would, certainly come into play for how we configure home living environments going forward, I would say, right?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, I'm somewhat doubtful that we're going to see like real significant shifts to virtual education, just because at least right now, like it's clear that in person is far superior. But I do think, much to the dismay of school kids everywhere, we may see the end of like snow days. You can imagine, like, now that schools are used to doing this for so long, like in the future, we used to get a week off school if there was a big snowstorm. And like, I could certainly imagine going forward that schools will just be like, oh no, we're just going to have virtual school until
Yeah,
the snow's plowed. I think we will see some stuff like that.
yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out. And I wouldn't disagree with you that I think in-person learning, offers a value that's really hard to do online. And I'm an online trainer too, so
Right.
it's like cutting your own throat saying that. But I mean, the reality is there's certain things there's certain things you can't replicate via a video conference. You can do a lot of it, but there's this interaction that people have when they're in the present, and it's, I think, kind of important. So in the introduction of your book, I thought this struck me right in the beginning when I picked up the book yesterday. You talked about the Mitaka lofts, that designed by was it Arakawa and Gins? I'm not sure
Yeah.
how. Okay, yeah, and that they took a very profound approach to architecture, right? Kind of disrupting what you would consider the normal indoor space, and their intent was to cheat death with the powerful weapon of architecture. To paraphrase what you said there. The fact that you took that and you actually let off with that in your book, obviously that must have struck a chord with you. How do you feel about that? Do you really think architecture has the power to have such a formative change?
Yeah, I mean, I picked that as my lead anecdote for a reason, because the idea that sort of architecture could make us immortal is so extreme and so provocative. I mean, I think in partly deliberately so. But then what I also think is interesting about it is, like, on one level, it's clearly nonsense. Like, I mean, at least personally, I think the idea of immortality caused by anything is nonsense, let alone
Sure.
architecture. But it's also interesting because there is, if you dig deep enough, like there is an underlying scientific truth or insight there that they were onto, which is one, that architecture can really have a powerful effect on our health throughout our lifespans. But two, there's a substantial amount of research on what's sometimes known as environmental enrichment. And so there's a lot of research to suggest that if we create sort of stimulating, challenging environments, that is good for our bodies and for our brains. And I don't think it's impossible that you could, if you have the right environment, you could start to think about extending lifespans. I think that's what's within the realm of possibility. So, the example is sort of intentionally a little bit of hyperbole to get people thinking, but I don't think it's as far-fetched as it might seem at sort of first glance.
Yeah, I mean, some of the data you cited tends to support that, right? That people in the urban environments have a tendency to have less issues with, the onset of dementia and things like that, where it seems like they're more brain activity maybe than people that spend most of their lives in a rural environment with less stimuli.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things is that if you think about like our convention for designing like assisted living or senior facilities, is usually they are sort of the opposite of stimulating, and they're bland and they're white and everything's safe. And like, I don't mean to discredit safety, like physical safety is important. But some of the researchers I talked to said like, maybe we should be thinking about ways to create sort of more engaging, slightly challenging environments, not that are gonna like put anyone's safety at risk, but
Sure.
Just making it this very easy beige place is maybe not great for people.
Yeah, not maybe to the extent that Arakawa was doing, with
right.
the, radical lines where you literally could become disoriented.
Right. Yes.
Probably not a good idea.
No, I mean, I don't think that would be good for anyone, frankly.
But that raises an interesting point though, because again, your environment and your actual environment, environmental surroundings, do in the indoors especially seem to have an effect on just your whole state of mind, right? I mean, people in a crowded, cramped environment, like even I would say even if you had equal air quality in spaces, the ergonomics, the lighting, the sound, all those other factors. Like we tend, I come from the IAQ world. We tend to talk in terms of indoor air quality, but really it's more of an indoor environmental quality that we're, coming up with a healthier indoor environment, right? That's the concern.
Yeah, well, I mean, every aspect you mentioned and basically every aspect you can think of has its own effects, and they do interact in some interesting ways. I talk about some research where, scientists basically used office workers as guinea pigs while they like changed, the lighting and the noise and the air temperature. And they found that in certain conditions, the subjects complained more about the air quality, but that wasn't something they were changing. So like when they made the office darker and colder, people had a lot more complaints about just like the quality of the air. And so I think our impressions of certain aspects of the environment can sort of color our view of the quality of the whole environment. But all of those aspects play a role in sort of how we function inside spaces.
Well, the Harvard Syracuse University studies, that came out a few years back, actually pushed some of that threshold. A lot of it was ventilation based, certainly, it was the cognitive effect of elevated carbon dioxide in the indoor environment, but they actually pushed other parameters in that study too, and looked at it. A lot of that research was actually done here in Syracuse, which is interesting. There's the Syracuse Center of Excellence is a research facility just down the street from us, where they do some very innovative things. I think this is interesting because you picked, there were several anecdotes that you picked for creating this book, various stories that became the stories within your story. But out of those stories, what indoor story affected you the most in writing this book? And tell me a little more about that. Like what really, you were dealing with this for several years, putting this book together. What really got your attention and really triggered you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There are a couple of stories that stick with me. One is I have a chapter on prison design, and I look at both the bad and the potentially good. So I spent some time corresponding with men who had been in solitary confinement, in some cases for years or even decades. And hearing their stories, these were letters, but like seeing them write about and hearing their stories about how being confined to this extremely barren, hostile space for years on end, that sticks with me. I mean, that's something that like you can't help but be affected by. And sort of on the flip side, I investigated like whether it's possible to design a humane prison. Like, is that an oxymoron? And like, what would that look like, or how could we improve prison design? And I got to tour. It was not a prison; it was a jail in California, a women's detention facility that was really rethinking a lot of the sort of conventional wisdom around correctional facility design. So it was actually designed by a firm that had never done a correctional facility before. They were known for school and college architecture. And so they designed something that looks a lot like a college campus. And, you know, there's security around the perimeter, but the women there like have freedom of movement. They can go from their dorm to the cafeteria to the classroom building. And so the idea of sort of rethinking some of those assumptions, I thought was really interesting as well.
Well, that's an approach. You know, I've read some articles based on some of the Scandinavian prison facilities, right? Where, and you look at the photos from them, and the insides of some of these facilities, even they're, I guess would be almost deemed their maximum security, look more like, you're right, like a single studio apartment. I mean, they're not fancy, they're Spartan, but they're, you know, they're not putting people in a 8x6 concrete bunker.
Right.
You know, and the logic. I remember reading an interview from one of the wardens at this facility, and I think some U.S. journalist commented that, oh, this is almost like a recreational facility. You know, this is almost like a vacation home. And his answer really struck me. That is like, no, you know, honestly, our goal here is not to be punitive. Our goal here is to try to, you know, reintroduce these people when their time is over back into society as productive citizens, not to turn them into animals.
Right. I mean, and that's what, you know, the saying that a lot of people in that field have and tell me is, you know, we send people to prison as punishment, not for punishment. That like the loss of freedom is the punishment, that we shouldn't pile on top of that these incredibly hostile, punitive environments. And, you know, you're right, this started in Scandinavia and it's much more common there than here. So one of the things I was looking at is like, could this kind of approach ever work in the US, which has this like carceral industry, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have for-profit. The whole for-profit prison system doesn't really encourage them to start building nicer facilities. You know, if anything, they're de-incentivized to do that, probably.
Right.
That's its own topic that we won't broach it. We'll let it roll from there. You know, you refer to yourself more than once in the book as an indoorsy person. You know, what does that mean to you, and how has this book changed your own indoor spaces? You know, and as a follow-up to that, do you have friends and family now asking you for advice on indoor air quality, indoor environmental topics?
I do. And so indoorsy is something that, you know, I kind of say as a joke, but it's one of those jokes that is also, you know, has the benefit of having some truth to it. And I don't mean that like I don't like nature. I love nature. You know, as I say, like I've gone camping and hiking, but like if you ask me what I want to do on a weekend, it's often not like go out on some hike somewhere or go kayaking or something. It's like I want to sit in a comfy chair and read. Like that's just the personality I've always had. In terms of my own indoor space, you know, I'm somewhat limited in how much I can change as a renter. But one thing I've definitely done is bring in a lot of plants. You know, bringing nature into our indoor spaces is one of the interventions that there is the most research support for. It just has benefits on almost every aspect of our functioning. And so probably have a couple dozen houseplants now. And I did not when I started this book.
That's interesting. We had a guest on several weeks back, Barun Agarwal from New Delhi in India. And he and his father-in-law were involved in the first, I believe, LEED platinum building in New Delhi. And I may have gotten that wrong. It might have been gold, but I think it was platinum. And they they have to deal with horrendous outside air. So the U.S. paradigm is always, well, you need more fresh air, right, to make the indoor environment better. But when you're in an environment like New Delhi, or maybe in Beijing, places where the outdoor PM 2.5 counts are horrific, 100 times higher, 1,000 times higher than we experience here. Outdoor air is not really a solution. So what they did that was very innovative is they took the top floor of their building and actually made the whole thing a greenhouse, and it's part of the air system. So they literally bring their air from their from the outdoor air through this greenhouse system to reduce carbon dioxide levels, and then through filtration as well to get particulate out of the air. But they're using, I believe, nearly 10,000 plants in one little thing for this building. Yeah. And so the concept of, they're using plants on steroids though. Their whole, they're actually, they don't have them in soil. They have them in such a way that the root structure can also adsorb or absorb, gaseous contaminants, and they're making it very effective. But is it more than just the effect? I obviously there's some beneficial effect that plants can have on the air in a space, but isn't it also a psychological effect for the occupant?
Oh yeah, it's there's a lot of research on. So just to run through a few, like exposure to nature in some way reduces stress, anxiety, and pain. It improves attention and focus. There's some really compelling studies out of Japan that shows that it actually boosts the immune system, and you can see that in like counts of white blood cells. So it has a lot of benefits even beyond air quality.
Now, I mean, there's certainly the flip side of that, right? Is that potentially when you bring plants and soil and you water the soil, you potentially have microbial considerations, right? Potentially.
Yes.
There can be a downside. You potentially have a lot of parasitic fungi on the plant soil, and so.
Yeah, though I guess I'll say that not all plant, in fact, lots of plant and soil associated microbes are totally benign, and some may even be beneficial. So, more microbes isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a question of which microbes.
Yeah, I think it's probably companies that are involved in the other solutions that probably fly the negatives about having plants indoors. Personally, I love the concept of a living wall in a commercial space, and seeing that, I just think it looks great. Which I guess let's get back to your first chapter of your book. Started talking about microbes in the indoor environment, and that seemed like was that up in the front of the book for a reason? You begin the book by going into your shower and pulling off your shower head.
Yeah, it is in the beginning of the book for a reason. And because sort of one of the arguments that I'm making with this book is that there's so much more happening in our buildings and in our indoor spaces than we typically appreciate or that we can even necessarily see. And I thought that microbes were the most sort of obvious example of that. We think of our homes as separate from the outdoors, but lots of outdoor microbes get in them, lots of other microbes get in them. It's just sort of a case study in how rich and complex our indoor environments are. So that was sort of what I was hoping to illustrate with that chapter.
So there, you were referencing, in the book, you referenced both the microbiome research and also, I believe, HomeChem, which were funded by the Sloan Institute. So that's, you had an opportunity, obviously, to speak with some of the researchers involved with that, right? And so one of the things that I've always brought up in this industry that I think it's always been a problem is that there seems to be very good research going on. So these studies, these programs that Sloan Institute did, both the microbiome and the HomeChem, I think are revolutionary, and it's great information, but it's again at the research side. And how does that get to the practitioner level? And then how does that from the practitioner actually get to the general public? Like, does this become actionable, or does this intel just stay in the academia realm?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And, in some ways, a lot of these studies, they represent enormous progress, because I think for a long time, it was just sort of conventional wisdom, tradition, best practice. Like, there wasn't really rigorous research at all about what our indoor ecosystems look like, what our indoor chemical exposures look like. And so the first thing you need to do before you can even get to recommendations and solutions is say like, well, what is the status quo? Like what is happening in our homes? And that is, sort of unfortunately the phase a lot of the researchers in right now. It's still, we're starting to just move past that where it's documenting like what are all the processes that are happening in our homes. The next step is, as you say, to start trying tweaks or interventions, or if we do this, how does that affect our chemical exposures, or how does that affect our indoor microbiome? And we don't have a lot of clear answers to that yet, but I mean, the research is happening, so it is moving in that direction. But I think researchers are saying that before they could even get to that phase, you just need sort of like some of these baseline studies to figure out what's actually happening.
But so ultimately, though, what do you think is more going to have more impact on the a general consumer's health, and their happiness? Is it the research, the science side of it, or is it the actual practice side? How do you see this playing out? Because I mean, research is all well and good, but if it doesn't actually create a change for the end user, has it achieved anything?
Though, I mean, I guess I would say that there is no practical side without the research. Or I mean, there is, but it needs to be based on evidence, right? So I mean, it takes both. And absolutely, we need like the practical recommendations and solutions for consumers, but they have to be based on evidence. Like I think there are way too many scenarios already where you see all sorts of products being sold, and some people have coined the term now, like Corona washing, things that are promised to have all these benefits, but they're really not proven. So I'm with you on the need to translate it to actionable information, but we have to start with the basic research.
I can concede that. It was interesting. A few years back, before we were doing the show as a weekly live stream, we had the opportunity to go down to that home chem research program at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Rich Corsi was there at the time, and Doctors Marina Vance and Delphine Farmer, and I had the opportunity to interview all of those individuals there, during the program and see what they were doing. And one of the things that struck me is they had done a test. It was a for those of you out in the audience who aren't familiar with it, it was a research house, a small ranch house with just literally millions of dollars of test equipment. And what they were doing is testing how the actions of individuals in their indoor space, in their indoor living space, would actually affect their indoor environments. They did a thing where they simulated cooking a Thanksgiving dinner, which you vaguely referenced in your book. I got to see some of the actual data from that, and it was startling, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the kind of thing that sort of I was just referencing where, I think there was a general sense that like cooking and cleaning could produce air pollutants, but this was one of the first projects to really rigorously quantify that. And, so that's the kind of like very basic research that they're doing. And it's a fascinating study.
So you mentioned that, the concerns for using antimicrobial products in the indoor environment. Elaborate on that a little bit. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, so here I'm talking mostly about sort of what you might think of as added antimicrobials. So not, we know that things like soap and water or, sunlight can sometimes kill microbes. And I'm talking more about like chemical additives like triclosan is a common one. And I think people would be startled, or some people would be startled to know how pervasive they've become in the built environment. I mean, they are added to so many consumer products now. Ones you might expect, like, hand soaps and cleaning products, but also like furniture. You see like textiles and materials and floor coverings that are impregnated with these chemicals. And they, I think, can have a couple of negative consequences. So one is there is now some research to suggest that they might be helping sort of spur the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. There's some interesting work that's been done showing that like homes that have higher levels of triclosan have bacteria with higher proportions of genes that are known to confer resistance to antibiotics. But then the other thing is that most of the microbes in our home are benign and some are actually beneficial. And so it's sort of this like crop duster approach to just killing all the microbes, which you don't really want. That, you definitely want to target pathogens, but you don't want to wipe out all the good microbes that might be hanging around.
Well, I mean, that comes even into play for, now with the pandemic. I find myself using hand sanitizer a lot. I really have never been a proponent of that because
Right.
that throws things out of whack. I mean, you're killing bacterium, and you're typically not killing fungal spores when you're using hand sanitizer. So I think you potentially open yourself up to, yeast infections and all kinds of stuff by, constantly hitting yourself with hand sanitizer to, in this case, now deal with a virus and, more readily kill bacteria, right? But they're not so great against fungi. So that, and again, it's a matter of balance, right? You're getting back to talking in terms of microbiome and the balance that on a microscopic level, the balance of the environment.
Right, and I do think it's fair to say that like the risk benefit calculus has shifted slightly right now. Like for sure, like
well, majorly, I think.
yeah,
More than
like
slightly.
I totally understand why, people might be disinfecting more than normal, and maybe there's the benefits right now outweigh the risks. But I do think it is worth thinking, the coronavirus is also a virus, not a bacteria. And do we really need to have all these chemicals just added to our products by default? I think there's a real reason to rethink that.
Well, I mean, you look at an enveloped virus, it seems like with a surfactant, right? A soap detergent is pretty effective at rendering it, incapable of infecting you. So
That's the other thing is,
I mean, do you actually need some high-end sanitizer, or is it just, really just vigorous cleaning with soap and water?
Yeah, I mean, and then there are other, things like bleach which some people are using more of, like can have all sorts of effects on air quality and irritate the lungs. And like, we just don't need it. Like soap and water, fortunately for this virus, really does enough. And so clean all you want, but do it with soap and water is sort of what I would recommend to people.
Yeah, I definitely concur with that. We, in my own home, got away from using most commercial cleaners a lot, several years back, like 5, 6 years now. We're pretty much just dealing with using water, using vinegar, using essential oils, and that's pretty much everything. Got away from the real heavy bathroom cleaners and, the spray surface supposed disinfecting type products. And I have noticed that our home seems cleaner, or at least equally as clean as it was with all those commercially available heavy chemical laden products. And the difference is now I feel very I can't stand being in heavy fragrance or heavy chemicals. If I walk into, I had a commercial client that was just got done doing commercial bathroom cleaning. I had to go in there and we were looking at a possible mold issue in the bathroom, and I couldn't breathe in the space because they had used some commercial cleaners in there, and it was just like, and that's the cleaner we use every day. I'm like, yikes! It's like people are breathing that stuff. It's like you're getting rid of bacteria and you're filling their lungs with chemicals.
Yeah, I mean, I get migraines, and those kinds of scents are like a major trigger for me. So, yeah, I mean, I think some of those chemicals absolutely have a purpose. Like bleach is an incredibly effective disinfectant, and there are times, especially like in medical environments, where it's useful
Against some organisms.
But I think we overuse it for sure, and use it in lots of scenarios we don't need it.
Yeah, I mean, sodium hypochlorite is quite effective against bacteria, not bad against viruses, not great against fungal spores. It's really not, when you're dealing with mold and various fungi, it's really not a great solution. And it's certainly not a safe solution. The quantities and the strength, the concentration you have to use. I think there's been this mindset of everybody equates all the microbes and to be treated the same way. We're going to just take this whole nuke approach of going in and blasting the environment. And one thing I did get from your book, and especially in that first chapter, is that we're out of balance. A lot of what we're doing is we have environmentally, right? The micro environment's out of balance, and probably our macro environment is too.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that's slowly beginning to change. Like, I think you've seen the human microbiome, the microbes that live in and on our body. I think there's been a real shift where the general public, a lot of people now understand that we don't want to be microbe free. I mean, we would die if we were microbe free.
Right.
And you see interest in things like probiotics and healthy balance. And the same is true for our homes. So, maybe the public awareness of that isn't quite there yet, but I do think that is beginning to shift. And hopefully people are starting to appreciate why microbial diversity and richness is really critical to our health.
But I mean, do you see potentially this COVID-19 pandemic as almost being a knee-jerk reaction to that? Because now people are like on the other side of the spectrum. So, oh, we have to kill all these microbes because they're killing us.
I do think that could be a setback. Again, I'm sympathetic and I understand why people want to err on the side of eradication right now. But, I've done some other interviews and written some pieces about microbes over the last month or two, and people are like, this is not what I need right now. And I get it. But, I would warn us not to overcorrect, I guess.
I mean, do you think that people, in general now, again, as in response to COVID, do you think people are going to make more inexpensive, maybe temporary fixes to their indoor spaces to deal with the virus until a vaccine's developed? Or do you think people are going to make permanent changes and start to, maybe adopt permanent practices and structural changes to how they live in the indoor environments? How do you read that?
I mean, I guess the jury's still out. I'd like to think that there will be some permanent changes, and I suspect there might be. It's hard to predict what those are. I guess also, though, I recognize that the truth about human nature is when certain threats or events are really prominent and really in our view, we tend to adapt to them and then forget quickly when the moment has passed. I think we'll probably see some of both, but sorry about that siren.
It's a live show and we're in our real environments.
Yeah. I think it's hard to say. I think that, there might be some structural changes or long-term changes, if people reconfigure HVAC systems or install air filters, that will sort of naturally last. But, whether everyone will keep washing their hands for 20 seconds, I sort of doubt. I think people are already, that time is slipping, but we'll see, I guess.
Well, we do as a society, as a whole, I think we do have a short attention span,
Yes.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, we're getting towards time here, but one point I did want to bring up, a running theme throughout your book is how poor people are underserved in the housing community, right? And how that changes their behavior, their health, their happiness. And you've said, or you do say in the book that the burden of the bad indoor environments falls mainly on the poor. In our last issue of the magazine, that was actually our cover story in June, talking about racism and its effect potentially on the indoor environments. Yeah, what do you think science can do to help resolve this problem, or is this clearly just still a political issue?
Yeah, I think it's less a scientific issue than a question of values. And one of the themes of the book is that what we design and what we build is a reflection of our values, of who we value, of what we value. So we know enough to design safe indoor environments. We've known for a long time how toxic lead is, but that didn't, help the residents of Flint very much. And so it's a question of really the political will and saying as a society, we don't accept this and we are going to make changes, whether they're zoning changes or federal standards or whatever they are, in making sure that everyone has access to a safe and healthy environment. And you're seeing that play out again with the pandemic, where if you look at, where the big hotspots have been and the super spreader events, they're in meat packing plants, which are occupied primarily by low income immigrant workers. They're in prisons, which are occupied primarily by people of color. They're in these environments that are occupied by people that we don't tend to value, or that society tends not to value as much. Yeah. That's not an accident.
No, it really isn't. We had a show dedicated to that 3 weeks back where we talked about the housing, and it was focused on sustainability, but still talking about some of the racial justice involved with what's going on with those different types of sectors, right? And just the terminology, what was brought up, one of the my co-host, who's usually here, Joe Medosh, asked the question of the term housing versus home. And we use the term housing to define the places where we put the undervalued people in our society, or the underserved people, underserved communities, right? It's housing.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but
Yeah,
that was
I didn't either. I
interesting.
was
Yeah.
blindsided by that live. I was like,
Yeah.
because define the two. What do the two mean? And I went, wow, you use that term housing when you're talking about Section 8 housing, when you're talking about,
Right.
And I think it's almost a marginalized term to use, because it's like right?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has different connotations than home.
It kind of does. And, and I think until such time as we actually start trying to get everyone in a home, and have that be a, an important factor,
Yeah.
we may not solve a lot of these issues. Tough, tough statements to get into toward the end of the show, and I don't really want to go down that path because we spent an hour on it a couple weeks ago. But I think it's an ongoing theme. I've seen this as a consultant in the IAQ industry for 33 years. It does seem like there's a disproportionate amount of poor indoor air quality factors occurring in the underserved communities.
Mm-hmm.
It just, right? It more so.
Well, and I guess if you want to put, end that discussion on a slightly more hopeful note, one of the takeaways and one of my messages is like, we have the knowledge now to build healthier indoor environments for everyone. Like, it's not a matter of not knowing how to do it. So like, if we decide it's something we want to do, it's like within our power to achieve that. So we can get there if we decide that that's important to us.
So what would be, we always do this at the end and ask the final closing question for you. What would be the one or maybe two, a limit of two, outcomes that you would like to see achieved by your book? This is like, you put this book together and it's out there for a reason, right? It wasn't just to sell books. It looks more like a passion project to me.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of at the broadest level. I guess I just want people to think a little bit more critically about their indoor spaces. I think that's one of the ironies, which is that we spend so much time indoors, 90% of our time indoors. But in some ways, these spaces are kind of unknown to us because I think they've become so familiar that we sort of overlook their complexity and their importance. They don't interest us because we think we know them like the back of our hand. So I guess I'd like people to sort of appreciate how much is going on in these environments and to sort of think critically about them. And then I guess, if people come away with one or two things they can put into practice in their own lives, whether that's getting a few houseplants or opening the kitchen window when they're cooking, or, figuring out how to create a home office space where they feel they can get stuff done. If people find like one takeaway they can improve their own lives with, I would be happy about that.
That's a pretty noble point there. This was great. I wish we had another hour, to be honest.
I can come back.
Well, you may have to, because unfortunately in 60 minutes, we always scratch the surface and then realize that we've not covered as many topics as we like to cover. But I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule and coming on with us at the Healthy Indoors Show today. So I, again, like to thank Emily Anthus. She's the author, again, of The Great Indoors. Book just recently released last month, and I highly recommend you grab a copy of this. So with that, we will return next Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the Healthy Indoors Show. So on behalf of my guest, Emily, and for the Healthy Indoors Show and Healthy Indoors Magazine, I'm Bob Krell. We'll see you next time. Please stay safe.